I got involved in the industry in the early 90s, and there were still pretty much bleeps and bloops, and but then the technology started to change in the mid 90s when CD-ROMs became available as a storage medium. That's when musicians started to, real musicians could actually start to record real instruments. In fact, a project I worked on called the Terminator was one of the first times an electric guitar had ever been heard and recorded for a video game, and that was in 1994. But the reality then was that the budgets weren't able to record big symphonies and this and that, so the budgets had to kind of catch up to the technology. And it really wasn't until the turn of the century when you started to see video games become this huge business and, multi-million-dollar productions happening, and now audio and music being thought of as something that is really important to the experience of a game. And so that's when, the games like Halo and Warcraft and Final Fantasy, God of War, Metal Gear Solid, all these sort of things happened around the turn of the century, and the music then brought it to a different level. Now, that being said, some of the old stuff, when we started to do the bleeps and bloops back then, because you only had two or three channels of voices, it was all about melody back then. So some of the greatest video game music was written back in the old days, like Mario, Zelda, Castlevania, things like that, because the melody had to be great, because that's all you had. My whole life, my two greatest loves and passions were video games and music. But I never thought to ever put the two together because, growing up in the 70s, there was no such thing as a video game composer. But it was interesting. When I was 10 years old, I used to take my dad's big portable cassette deck, and I would go down to the local arcades and the local pizza parlors where the video games were back then, and I would record all my favorite video games on cassette, and then I'd bring it home and I'd record all my favorite game systems and my computers and all my games, and I would splice the tapes together, and then I'd invite my neighborhood friends over. I'd charge them a nickel, and I'd play back the cassette while I put my favorite video games on a television set behind me, and I'd grab my guitar or a broomstick, and I would pretend to be putting on a video game show. Who knew 30 years later we'd be doing it for real here? But when I turned 21, I decided to. I grew up on the East Coast, and when I turned 21, I left my parents crying on the doorstep, and I wanted to go to California. And I drove to California with no friends, no job, no money, no place to go. Just got in my car and drove out. And the only thing I really knew was Disneyland. And so I showed up, and I was actually homeless. The first 3 weeks I was in California, I was living under a pier at Huntington Beach. And but the first day I was there, I picked up a newspaper, and I saw a job for selling keyboards at a guitar store. And I went down there the next day, and they said, "Yeah, sure, you start tomorrow." And I showed up for work the first day, and I was wearing a video game T-shirt. And this is back in 1990 when there wasn't a lot of video game T-shirts around, but I was so into it that I happened to have them. And the very first person who walked in, the first customer I waited on, happened to be a producer at Virgin right down the street. Then they were starting a company, a video game company. And he asked me if I knew about video games. And I said, "Are you kidding me?" And I proceeded to download 20 years of my knowledge on this poor guy. And he says, "You want a job? We'll pay you $6 an hour to play video games for us and tell me what's wrong with them." So I was in California 3 days, and I was in the video game industry. That was over 20 years ago. And I'm like, wow, this California is a pretty great place. They're paying me to play video games. But what I would do is I would bug the vice president of the company every day to say, "Hey, if you ever need music, let me know. I'll learn how to do it. I'll do it for free. So if it doesn't work out, you lose nothing, but please give me a chance." And they did. And the first game I worked on was the original Prince of Persia game. And we won some awards and got some good reviews, so they decided to make me the music guy. You know, when I first started doing game music, it was a bunch of bleeps and bloops, and most of the time, game music back then, you had to be a computer programmer in order to program music. So, you know, guys were typing out music on a computer keyboard or mouse clicking, and I was saying to myself, like, well, how do you mouse click the blues? You know, you can't, you know, this is something that comes from here, you know, not necessarily up here, music, you know. And so what I did is I had the programmers build me systems where I could actually take my electronic keyboard and they would hook it right into the actual video game consoles at the time, and I was able to play the video game console and then record that data onto what they call a music sequencer, and you know, it would record my notes and everything into this thing, and then I could translate that into something that the program and the programmers could use. And so that was kind of revolutionary at the time. But what it allowed me to do is I was able to do real music. I was able to play an instrument instead of writing it on paper. You know, I don't know how to read music. I've played music by ear my entire life. So I'm able to hear something and play it back. And so being in that situation where I had to play something in order for me to have an existence in this industry, I needed to have technology to help me do that. And so we created these things with programmers. And for the first time in games, a lot of times now it was emotion and real music being played as opposed to, you know, mouse clicking. And I think that definitely moved the industry along, I think, in terms of real musicians now doing music for games. My goal in creating Video Games Live is I wanted to prove to the world how culturally significant and artistic video games have become. You know, a lot of people might think that video game music is still a bunch of bleeps and bloops, but we've come so far, especially over the last 10 years. But I wanted to create a show for everyone, not just for the hardcore gamers. Hardcore gamers know how great video game music is because they play them every day. But I wanted to create a show for everyone. You know, some of the greatest comments that we get from our show are from those non-gamers, are from the grandparents who brought the grandkids to the symphony for the first time, or the mom who brought the neighborhood kids, or the girlfriend who was taking her boyfriend out for a night on the symphony. And those are the people who are most taken back by what they're hearing and what they're seeing because they don't expect it, you know? And so that was really important for me. So, you know, for me, Video Games Live is all the greatest video game music of all time, played by a full symphony and choir. But what makes it really special and unique is that everything is completely synchronized to massive video screens and rock and roll lighting and lasers and special effects and a stage show production and interactive elements with the crowd. In fact, I like to describe Video Games Live as having all of the power and emotion of a symphony orchestra combined with the energy and excitement of a rock concert, mixed together with all the cutting-edge visuals and technology and interactivity and fun that video games provide. So Video Games Live, we're ushering in a whole new generation of people to come out and appreciate a symphony. And it's really, we're taking the old stuff, you know, the art and the culture of symphonic orchestral music, and combining it with technology and, you know, mashing those two together to create this one really dynamic and exciting show for everyone. And that's why the visuals are so important. You don't have to know a darn thing at all about video games in order to come to the show and be able to follow along with what the visuals are showing and how the music and why that music was written, why it's sounding the way it does to match the visuals. And I think that's one of the most exciting things for us, is knowing that so many millions of people around the world are getting turned on to a whole new genre of music that they didn't really have any idea about. And that's really cool for me. You know, the amazing thing about video game music and Video Games Live is that we travel all over the world. And no matter where we travel, people are coming out by the thousands to appreciate and listen to this music. No matter where we go, we've played in China and Taiwan and Korea, to New Zealand and Mexico and Brazil, all over North America, all over Europe. I mean, we've played countries like Poland, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, France, England, you name it, we've been there. And to have people come out no matter where we are, I think that says a lot about the video game industry and how universal video game music is. There's a lot of bands out there that can't even say that. They might be super popular in Germany, but maybe not so much in Korea. Whereas wherever we go, people are coming out, and I think that says a lot about our industry. One of the cool things about video games live is it really is having an effect on people even after they leave the show. Some of the best emails and letters that we get after a performance aren't from the hardcore gamers, but they're from the moms and dads and the grandparents who will say something like, we went to the show, we took our kids to the show, we didn't know what to expect, we don't really play video games, but boy, we were really blown away. We didn't expect the music to be so powerful and emotional, and the graphics and the visuals to be so incredible and cutting edge. I get it now. Now I know why my kids are so much into video games. Thank you for helping us to open our eyes. But the other letters that we'll get are from those same parents who will say something like, we were sitting around the breakfast table talking about your show last night, and my 8-year-old daughter said, "Mommy, I'd like to start taking violin lessons now so that I can learn the music to Halo or Kingdom Hearts or, something like that." So, when I was growing up, and I kind of grew up, listening to my parents' music was, music of the 50s, and growing up in the 70s, listening to rock and roll and, bands like Aerosmith and Van Halen and things like that. But then in 1977, when I was about 10 years old, I went to see Star Wars. And that music, it was the first time that symphonic music that I paid attention as a 10-year-old saying, wow, what's that? That's what I want to do. And then as I started to do a little more research, and this guy John Williams, and he's this amazing composer, But his influences were classical composers. And so I started listening to Beethoven. And when I heard Beethoven, for me it was all over. That's when I had my premonition, and where I said, this is, it affected my life, But it was because of pop culture that got me interested in classical music. And I think the same thing we're seeing happen 30 years later now with video games, where people are watching and playing and listening to video games and coming to our show going, wow, I want to learn how to play music, or, I want to learn how to play the piano. Instead of the classics, I want to learn how to play video game music on the piano. But then later, that love and that passion gets them interested in other parts of music. I think that's really cool. Video game composers, when we're creating music, we have a lot of different challenges than other composers for either film or television or other mediums. For example, we have interactivity, right? So as a game composer, I might sit down with a designer, and we don't have linear media. So our media can go off and branch off in any different way. So when we create the music, we might create a song or a segment for that particular scene, but we know at any point it can branch off into different areas. So what we'll do is we think in terms of this piece of music, but where else could it go? What other different arrangements of that same piece of music could I do? Could we bring in more horns, more percussion, maybe less choir or more choir? A lot of film and television music are considered background music, or they might call it incidental music, because in films and television, it's about talking and dialogue. They have to tell a story. Whereas with video games, I like to call what we do foreground music because it's action and interactivity that drive our medium. So our music is out front driving the action at all times. And, it's for all these reasons that I've always thought and said that, if Beethoven were alive today, I think he'd be a video game composer.